I'd like to welcome all of you to the FASEB Instrumentation tutorial on Laser-Doppler Blood Flowmetry. When we were asked to put on this symposium, it was indeed a timely request because we had just finished publishing a book on the topic, and all of today's speakers are contributors to our recent book. May I have the next slide, please? Oops, I have to do that myself. Now, I should remind the audience that our proceedings today are being videotaped, and if you fill out the forms that were handed to you when you came in the room, you'll be put on a mailing list, and if you have any desire to see this performance replayed, you can borrow the videotape. Transonics has a series of tapes on other topics that you can borrow from them as well. First, let me give you an overview of our program today. I'll give a brief introduction on the history of Laser-Doppler Blood Flowmetry, the kinds of techniques and developments that led up to Laser-Doppler Blood Flowmetry. I'll be followed by Dr. Bonner from the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Bonner is a physicist who's made important contributions to our understanding of the optical properties of tissue and the fundamental principles upon which Laser-Doppler Flowmetry is based. After Bonner's presentation, my colleague Jeffrey Keel will speak about measuring blood flow in the gastrointestinal tract. As many of you know, particularly the physiologists, the gastrointestinal tract is composed of a series of tissues within the wall of the stomach or intestine, and this stratification of tissues presents some particular challenges to measurement of blood flow by the Laser-Doppler technique. After Dr. Keel's presentation, Dr. John Johnson will speak on one of the most common uses of the Laser-Doppler method, namely the measurement of blood flow in the human cutaneous circulation. Dr. Johnson will present some of his studies that validate the use of Laser-Doppler Flowmetry in this particular vascular bed, and he'll share with us some of his insights into physiological mechanisms regulating this circulation, insights that were made possible by this new flow measuring technique. And then our final speaker on the program is Dr. Gert Nielsen from Linköping, Sweden. Dr. Nielsen is a biomedical engineer who's made important contributions to the design of the instruments themselves, and he will also take us into some of the developments now ongoing in his laboratory. He's attempting to create two-dimensional maps of blood flow below the surface of tissues. And our format is essentially to have all of the speakers present their material without interruption, and so I'd like to ask you to hold your questions to the end, and at that time we'll have ample opportunity for roundtable discussion. If you jot down your questions, then at the end you can direct your question to any particular speaker or to the panel in general. Now let me begin with an acoustic example of our old friend, the Doppler Principle. As you know, if you have a source of a sound wave that's stationary and a listener who's also stationary, then he will experience c times t number of waves in a given interval of time t, where c represents the speed of sound. Now, if the same listener then is in motion, he will experience the same number of waves in the interval ct, but he will also experience the number of waves through which he travels, thus hearing a higher frequency. Could I have the next slide? Oops. Now, if we were going to use the Doppler principle to determine the velocity of some object in motion, I'll start with a couple of familiar examples. The radar speed trap is used to determine the velocity of a motorist whose speed is on the order of miles per hour or meters per second. To do so, we would use radar, which operates in the frequency range of about 10 megahertz, and as we all know from experience, the Doppler shift on the order of 30 hertz per mile per hour is sufficient for us to design practical instruments to clock the speeding motorist. Now, to clock the speeding red blood cell, whose speed is on the order of only millimeters per second, we need a higher frequency for our signal. So using laser light, which is on the order of terahertz range, allows us to detect small Doppler shifts on the order of 300 hertz per millimeter per second. And it's based on this, that is the high frequency of laser light and its spectral purity, that allow us to measure red cell velocities in perfused tissue. Now, over the years, the laser Doppler technique has been implemented in a variety of different ways in attempts to measure blood flow. There's a whole family of blood flow measuring devices that exploit the Doppler principle. There are retinal velocimeters, laser Doppler microscope systems, laser Doppler catheters, and a relative newcomer is the main topic of today's presentation, the measurement of blood flow in tissue in which the blood vessels are essentially microscopic in size. And then finally, Dr. Nielsen in his presentation will touch on one of the newest developments, the attempts to map blood flow in tissue. A classic example of the retinal velocimeter, as developed by Riva's group in Boston, would use a laser to focus a beam onto a single blood vessel on the retina, then collect the scattered light and send it to a detector for appropriate processing. So this kind of technique would allow one to measure velocity in a particular retinal vessel. The laser Doppler microscope would typically be employed with a thin, transparent tissue, such as the mesentery or the toe web of a frog. This would allow conventional video microscopy and at the same time allow the laser beam to pass through a particular blood vessel in the thin, transilluminated tissue. The laser Doppler catheter consists of fiber optic light guides that are fashioned together into the form of a thin catheter, and with a system such as this, we use a fiber to deliver laser light to the flowing blood, another fiber to collect the scattered light and carry it back to an appropriate detector. And then our main interest in today's presentation, though, is the measurement of blood flow in tissue, in a small volume of tissue in which the only blood vessels present are of microscopic dimensions. And in this case, we deliver laser light to the tissue where it's diffusely scattered. Much of the light that returns to the detector by way of the receiving fiber has interacted only with static tissue elements, but a small fraction of it has interacted with moving red blood cells and thereby experienced a frequency shift. So these two types of light would be captured by the receiving fiber and carried back to the detector. Now, if we look over the chronology of the developments that made laser Doppler blood flowmetry possible, you can see that we began, of course, with the discovery of the Doppler effect itself and its verification, and then later the principle of light beating spectroscopy. This was a laboratory curiosity, but it essentially showed that light, like electricity, if falling on a detector with two different frequency components, would establish in the output of the detector a beat frequency proportional to the difference between those frequencies. Now, what made light beating spectroscopy quite practical was the invention of the laser with its high spectral purity, so that these beat frequencies could be easily determined. And in fact, light beating with lasers was developed by Javon and used as a means of calibrating one laser with respect to another. They would simply have both beams falling on the same detector. Then later, Ye and Cummings employed this technique to develop the field that we today call laser Doppler velocimetry. They showed that it was practical under laminar flow conditions to collect the scattered light and make regional measurements of the velocity of flow from the light scattered by impurities and particles in the flowing medium. Now, once this art of laser Doppler velocimetry was born, it developed first for industrial purposes, for measurements of jet exhausts and corrosive fluids. And it was only later that the laser Doppler principle began to be employed for measurements of blood flow. And as you can see, the retinal velocimeter, the laser Doppler microscope, the catheter velocimeter using the Doppler principle all came along in the mid-1970s. And the first investigator to suggest that blood flow could be measured in perfused tissue was Mike Stern, who was working then at the National Institutes of Health. Following Stern's note in Nature and his subsequent publications on the application of this in different vascular beds, the commercial phase began, and various instruments were employed for use in different vascular beds. And it was not until the early 80s that Bonner and Nossel published their theory and laid a foundation for the principle of the measurement. So once Bonner and Nossel published their theory, it served as a useful conceptual framework for the further development of these instruments. Now, according to that approach, a photon could experience various fates once it reaches the tissue. From this transmitting fiber, much of the light would simply be scattered away and lost forever. Some would be optically absorbed. But the two components of particular interest are the light that's interacted simply with static tissue elements and actually made it back to the receiving fiber. Similarly, the very small fraction of that that's interacted with one or more moving red blood cells and experienced Doppler shifts. So it's these two types of light then that at the photodetector should set up beat frequencies. And it's not surprising that because the photons strike red blood cells at various angles and the red cells themselves travel at various velocities, that the detector does not put out a single frequency, but a spectrum of them. In fact, when Mike Stern brought this idea to San Antonio, the frustration we experienced was knowing that there was great promise in his technique, but there were no commercial instruments available at that time. So we set up a loop of isolated canine small bowel and a spectrum analyzer, and we recorded these Doppler spectra when we illuminated the surface of the small bowel with a laser beam. As you can see, in the absence of blood flow when the vessel was occluded that supplied this preparation, we recorded a noise spectrum. Then under control conditions, you see that the spectrum has more higher frequency components, and then when we released the vascular occlusion and produced a reactive hyperemia, there was a further upward shift in the spectrum, and there were more high frequency components. So as I mentioned, it was quite frustrating to see that there was clearly information about blood flow in these spectra, but the challenge was to develop instruments to extract it. Now, according to the Bonner-Nossel theory, the mean frequency of that Doppler spectrum should be proportional to the root mean square velocity of the red blood cell and a factor that depends on the average number of collisions a photon has made with moving red blood cells. And this theory then provides us some insight into the kind of information that can be extracted from these spectra. The commercially available instruments today all have at least 3 different outputs and usually with various labels on them. The first of these, in terms of its physiological importance, I think, is the measurement of blood flow or the red blood cell flux in the volume of tissue from which the scattered light is received. The second of these is the relative number of the moving red blood cells, or a so-called tissue hematocrit, and this is sometimes unfortunately termed a blood volume output. And then the third fundamental parameter, of course, is the speed of the red blood cells in motion. Now, since the technique has a high frequency response and yields an essentially continuous measurement, of course, it allows us to record rapid oscillations in blood flow as well. So there's a lot of useful information that we can obtain with modern laser-Doppler blood flow meters. Now, before we go to our speakers, I'd like to throw out a few questions for you to keep in mind. You might want to use these on our speakers during our roundtable discussion. Of course, the first one is the principle of the measurement. One of the impediments to the progress of this technique is that the principle, in fact, is somewhat complicated, particularly for biologists like me. The second, what about the advantages and disadvantages? This is not a perfect method, and depending on the application and the vascular bed and the peculiarities associated with it, the laser Doppler technique will have certain advantages and disadvantages. A couple of somewhat controversial questions are the volume of tissue or the depth in which the laser Doppler signal arises, the question of its calibration and its linearity, and then finally, if you have some specific vascular bed in mind in which you'd like to use this technique, you'd probably like to know whether it's already been used successfully or what pioneering you'll have to do in order to convince the scientific community that your measurements in that particular vascular bed are truly valid. Now, I hope I've set a good example in not going over my time allotment, and what I'll do now is introduce the next speaker, who's Dr. Robert Bonner from the National Institutes of Health.
Pretty much a third generation NIH prototype. The first one I was involved in constructing, which was built around 1978. And here you can see there's a measurement of forearm blood flow with a reactive hyperemia. And we use fiber optics to go from the instrument to the tissue. And you can see there's a broad glow here using a helium neon laser, red light. So somehow the light's going into the tissue. You can see a speckle effect, that is interference on your eye that looks like speckles if there's very little flow, but as the flow increases, that speckle starts to dance. And the instrument is basically measuring properties of that fluctuations in the light and measuring our various parameters. Now, when you put light in at a point and then look at it coming out at a nearby point within, say, a half millimeter or a millimeter, the light really tends to go over fairly shallow paths and doesn't penetrate very deeply. And clearly, if you've got a heterogeneous microvasculature, you're really just sampling superficial flow. And it's a very local volume. It's only on the order of a millimeter. I'll get to that later. If we look at the signal that's detected and actually look at the spectrum of the light, as Pete showed some early examples, you can have in the absence of any flow, there's some very low frequency artifact, and then as the flow changes, you get increasing amounts of Doppler shifted power or signal that's been Doppler shifted with increasing frequencies, where this is the frequency axis. So the mean frequency increases and the total area under this curve increases because you've got increasing amounts of power. The signals are processed by all these machines. They're really, I think, only two sets of algorithms, one originating, I think, from the NIH group, and then the other one is the TSI version. But they all measure essentially the same thing. And here's an example of the kind of signals you can get. You can get resting flow. We've compressed the time here. We do an occlusion of various durations here. And then you can look at a reactive hyperemia. And this is the reactive hyperemia of the forearm. But you can see pulsations. You can have very good time resolution to look at the pulsatility in the microcirculation over the cardiac cycle, as well as being able to follow the rapid dynamics. And that's probably the thing that's most impressive about this technique, is measuring rapid dynamics. This is an example of the general kind of block diagram of what the instrument does. We put the laser light through an optical fiber. We found back in the late 70s that using graded index fibers really minimized, small graded index fibers really minimized the interference in the fibers, mode competition in the fibers, and gave us fairly stable, artifact-free signals in general. The algorithms are basically looking at here the total power that's Doppler shifted, which can be normalized by the reflected light to give us a measure of volume or number density of moving red cells, what fraction of the light is Doppler shifted. Or we can weight it by a frequency-dependent factor and then square it and get the first moment of the power spectrum. That is the mean frequency times the total power that's Doppler shifted. If we normalize that to the reflected intensity, the reflected power, we get our blood flow, quote, blood flow parameter. The various parameters are this quote, volumetric red blood cell flow, which is related to the red cell volume flowing in a given volume of tissue in a given amount of time. The parameter really is measuring the product of the number density of moving red cells, that is those which is derived from the fraction of light that's Doppler shifted, and the mean RMS speed, which is determined from the mean Doppler shift. The product of these two gives us this quote, flow parameter, which really has units of volumetric flow times length. It's got an extra length factor, and that's related to the path of a red cell through the measurement volume. If you use I'm skipping the equations in the model to give you the end results. The model is very complicated in dealing with the optics and the coherent signals, but if you get the book, Pete's book, you can read that at your leisure. But here's an example of the fact that really there are nonlinearities in this measurement that have to do with when the light becomes multiple scattered, a given photon is multiple Doppler shifted, then the Doppler shifts actually increase because the Doppler shifts are additive of a photon that's scattered, Doppler shifted twice. You get a Doppler shift, and then you get an addition, a random addition, plus or minus, of the next Doppler shift. So the actual, quote, speed or frequency Doppler broadening increases. The volume decreases more strongly because of nonlinearities in terms of the fraction of the light that's Doppler shifted. As most of the light becomes Doppler shifted, it's not going to be linear with increasing the number of red cells. And the flow parameter has intermediate nonlinearity. Those things are attempted to be corrected in most of these instruments, although based on relatively simple models. Here's just an example of this number density of moving red cells versus blood flow. Here we've got vasomotion in a sickle cell patient, but you can see these parameters may vary. Here we've got a very strong correlation between the two, although they, in some cases we'll see that such as measuring in the nasal mucosa, when we've looked at a variety of patients, if you compare the blood flow versus speed, they're the two factors that seem to co-vary very strongly, whereas if you compare blood flow versus volume, it's a relatively flat spectrum correlation. I'd like to attempt to just go through some explanations of some of Pete's questions in terms of what this device measures, what are the measurement volumes, and what are the problems with making measurements. This is some of Pete's data using the TSI device. Here we have a comparison of the Laser-Doppler flow output in the TSI device. It's frequency times a fraction of the light that's Doppler shifted. So this is not just volts, it's really hertz are the units, and versus total hepatic blood flow. This is measurement of two sites, and we get very good linearity in this case, but clearly the slopes are, in this example, differ at these two sites by a factor of 2. This is a very local measurement of blood flow, and so there are lots of questions about how uniform it is or how representative the surface flow is to total organ flow. Well, why should the device be linear at all? If you conventional light scattering, quasi-elastic light scattering spectrometry or laser-Doppler velocimetry would have light incident on a sample, and you would collect the light at a well-defined angle. And this angle, just like in Doppler ultrasound, is critical in terms of determining the scale factor. So if you look at backscatter geometries, the Doppler shifts are much greater. If you look directly in the forward direction, there's no Doppler shift. So you would expect there to be a strong angle dependence and of the scattering process, and that certainly led to some confusion early on in terms of when you look at reflected light from the tissue, what kind of Doppler shifts are you really measuring? If you look at tissue optics, light incident propagating through tissue generally hits a scatterer in the tissue that isn't moving. It won't impart a Doppler shift, but it'll be scattered to an angle here, theta 1. That angle usually is fairly small, something on the order of maybe 20 degrees. So you can see for light to actually turn back and go backwards, it has to be scattered many times by these static elements. If light would typically, in going through the tissue, it'll go through a step where it interacts with many static elements, and then periodically it may hit a red cell that's moving. Unlike this diagram, theta 2 for red blood cells is really very much smaller because it's on the order of the wavelength of light, and the scattering angle there is really only on the order of a few degrees. So you have a very small angular scattering, and that imparts, it's almost forward scattering, a very low amplitude Doppler shift, low frequency Doppler shift. So to put that in some context, as Pete showed a variety of slides, if you have a variety of optical paths through the tissue, and most of those photon paths, at least for small fiber separations, will interact, or with relatively low density of moving red cells in the tissue, will interact mainly with static elements and maybe not interact at all with the moving red cell. Those paths that do interact with the moving red cell will be scattered through a range of angles, and all of those angles will be collected because the light is diffusely backscattered by the static tissue elements. That means that the angle that determines the Doppler shift is really determined by the size of the red cell and is kind of an internal universal scale factor unless the red cell size varies from one animal to another or from one patient to another. In most settings, the mean red cell size is fairly constant, but that determines the angle of the Doppler shift. In fact, it's a range of angles, and that means there are a whole range of Doppler shifts for a given frequency. What that means is one cannot obtain clear information about the distribution of frequencies, but one can come up with mean parameters, such as the mean frequency. The signals, if you actually look at the detected signals, you usually, in the case of a static tissue with no motion, you have essentially shot noise with maybe some very low frequency, low amplitude motion artifact. If you look at a higher flow tissue, you get higher amplitude fluctuations with a higher frequency component. And if you're looking at low flow, they're relatively low frequencies and low amplitude. How are the different parameters related? In the case of a simple comparison, if you had a given tissue and you just tripled the velocity of the red cells, the mean speed of the red cells, you'll get an increased Doppler shift. You'll get a Doppler broadening of the spectrum, but you won't get a change in the amplitude. This Doppler broadening comes about, it's not a well-defined frequency because we're sampling over a whole range of scattering angles. On the other hand, if we just increase the number density of moving red cells within the volume, so there are more of them, you're more likely to have a scattering event, then what happens is there's an increase in the power of the light that's Doppler shifted, or the fraction of the light that's Doppler shifted, without a change in the frequency characteristics, as long as you're in the, quote, linear range of these devices, which is for when multiple scattering, that is multiple Doppler shifts from red cells by a given photon, is relatively unlikely. One of the biggest problems in the early days was trying to minimize motional artifacts that had to do with the delivery systems, either motion of your detector relative to the tissue or internal motion in the tissue. And as I said, using the graded index fibers, these signals could be compressed to very low frequencies for the most part. There is some spillover into the measurement region, but for the most part, one can avoid motional artifacts and look at this band pass where virtually all of the signal is related to blood flow or moving red cells in the absence of very gross tissue motion, such as a beating heart, where there's a lot of internal motion in the tissue. So if one excludes the low frequencies, one can make reasonable measurements of mean Doppler broadening. Let's talk briefly about the measurement artifacts. This is a very easy technique to make measurements. You get a continuous output. It's also very easy to get data that has artifacts in them that are buried, and you may not be aware of them. They're clearly physical and instrumentational problems, such as optical fiber noise. This principally arises from mode mixing in the fiber. That's complicated optics, but particularly using step index fiber, these phase, the different modes will then have phase shifts, and it'll get interference effects, so that if you change the mode mixing by bending the fiber, you can get changes you can get a fluctuating component of artifact. The problem is pretty much overcome by using graded index fibers where there isn't a path length difference between the different modes in the fiber. There are laser instability problems. This is principally as the laser warms up and it goes under, has longitudinal mode transitions. Usually that's just a transient spike in some of the commercial systems. A lot of the systems are thermally stabilized, and that's avoided. Using rigid stereotactic devices clearly lead to a variety of problems where the probe is vibrating, very small motions, but vibrating relative to the tissue. And this can lead to a background increase just due to this motion of the probe relative to the tissue. I'll skip 4 because Kurt Nielsen tells me that in fact the Paramed does use this DC power normalization, but it clearly is important to use the correct normalization to avoid surface reflections or extraneous signals and then normalize to the reflected light. And more importantly, for those devices that are applying a constant calibration factor for various tissues, one of the main limitations is the variation in the mean path length in the tissues. You have a fixed probe geometry, fixed laser, but the optics in the tissue may vary, so that in one tissue where the absorption is less or the scattering is less strong, like in muscle, the path length may be longer. There are a whole variety of physiological artifacts. A common one is external compression of the probe, external compression by the probe of the tissue, which creates an extravascular pressure, which invariably will create at least a transient change in the blood flow. Internal tissue motion is clearly a problem in the extreme examples. You can see it in fasciculations in muscle. We were doing a bunch of patients during muscle biopsy that had fasciculations. They would lead to transient spikes. You can have peristalsis in the intestine. Pete's very familiar with that. Respiratory motion is a very common artifact, particularly when dealing with small animals. And in the extreme case, trying to measure epicardial blood flow, there's a very strong component due to the contraction of the muscle. Another physiological artifact can be due to large changes in the tissue optics. You might imagine that a brain undergoing edema would change its scattering properties. Absorption effects may occur, particularly if the path length is long and blood volume changes quite a bit, or oxygenation levels change a lot with the Heaney laser systems. Another factor that's unknown is the microcirculatory changes in tortuosity. If the blood is highly tortuous, then you have more volume for a given volumetric blood flow. You've got a larger volume in your sample, larger number of red cells in your sample volume for a given flow, and that would change your calibration factor. And clearly, because we're measuring superficial flow, there might be variations in that superficial tissue structure and the vasculature in that tissue in normals and disease, and you might see changes that have to do with that architecture and not merely just functional changes. There are a variety of instruments. This is the Med Pacific instrument. Again, it uses an algorithm basically like ours. The Paramed system, I don't see in here where it normalizes to DC power, but other than that, it is essentially a very similar algorithm. The Tsi instrument is a little bit different. It uses digital electronics, but basically trying to come up with the same parameters, flow, volume, and velocity. To talk briefly about the measurement volume, if you look at the intensity of the reflected light off of tissue as you vary the fiber separation, this is from skin, there's a very strong fall off. This is log 10. So there really is a limitation of how far apart the fibers can be put. As you move the fibers farther and farther apart, the multiple Doppler shifting off of red cells becomes a more extreme problem. It becomes harder to linearize the output. And one can see that as one varies the fiber separation. This is the path length. It increases almost linearly, and it will change with the optical parameters of the tissue. We've made measurements like that with the laser Doppler velocimeter and shown that, in fact, this number density of moving red cells, or the fraction of the light that's Doppler shifted, does increase as you increase the fiber separation. That is, you're increasing the path length, so you're changing your calibration factor. And here we've got a low volume, and here's a high volume. So you can see there's a greater fraction with a warmed tissue. In terms of the actual sample volume, the sample volume isn't precisely defined. It's probabilistic in terms of the distribution of photon paths in the tissue. So here, if we separate the fibers by 0.5 millimeter, which is a conventional geometry, and we're using relatively small fibers, say 50 to 100 micron core, the solid line is the sampling as a function of depth with the 785 nanometer. The dashed line is the sampling as a function of depth with the 633 nanometer helium neon. So that solid is laser diode and the dashed is helium neon. You can see they're very similar, but you clearly are weighting the surface layers in the top 0.5 millimeter much more strongly, and you get some component from increasing depth, but it's essentially exponentially decaying with depth. So it's a probabilistic factor. If you look at the dimension parallel to the surface and perpendicular to the fiber axis, you can see, again, you only measure within about 5/10 of a millimeter between along the line of the centering the fibers. You measured either side about half a millimeter. So the measurement volume is on the order of a cubic millimeter. It's a very small sample volume, but it's not precisely defined. There are components from deeper layers, although they're attenuated. When you're dealing with heterogeneous tissues, that clearly can lead to some variations, particularly if those structures change. Okay, that's just an example of the heterogeneity of the flow, and I think I can pretty much. I wanted to just mention briefly the three parameters: the mean red blood cell speed, which is computed from the mean Doppler broadening in hertz of the Doppler shifted signal. It's really related to the mean speed of all RBCs moving greater than a minimal speed that leads to a minimal Doppler shift. This is slightly nonlinear at high blood volumes. It's almost independent of tissue optics and relatively insensitive to minor motional artifacts, particularly if the mean speed of the red blood cells is high compared to those motional velocities, internal motional. The number density of flowing red cells, which is often referred to as blood volume, is computed from the fraction of the reflected light that's Doppler shifted more than 30 hertz. It measures the number of moving red cells which are moving greater than this minimal speed per unit volume of tissue. It's extremely sensitive to motional artifacts within the tissue or the probe relative to the tissue. And the calibration is dependent upon the mean path length. It's linearly dependent on the mean path length in the tissue, which is dependent upon probe geometry and tissue optics. and it cannot be accurately linearized at high values of optical path, at high values of volume or number density of red cells or optical path lengths. And finally, the blood flow or perfusion parameter is computed as the reflected intensity normalized first moment of the power spectrum. It measures the number density times the mean speed of the RBCs per unit volume of tissue. This is volumetric flow of the red blood cells times the mean RBC path length within the volume. In many studies, this has been shown to be linear with other measures of blood flow, and it is sensitive to motional artifacts, but that sensitivity is dependent upon the algorithm. As I said, there are really two different classes of algorithms used. The calibration is dependent upon the mean photon path length in the tissue, which again is dependent upon probe geometry and tissue optics. Thank you.
And our speaker is Dr. Jeff Keel.
Thank you, Dr. Shepard. My interest in laser-Doppler velocimetry, or flowmetry as it's now called, started about 9 years ago when I joined Dr. Shepard's lab. At that time, laser-Doppler flowmetry was in its infancy, and there were no commercial units available. There were really just a few prototypes around the country. Now, our physiologic interest was in looking at the local control of the circulation in the GI tract. And previous work in the GI tract had come to conclusions about local mechanisms based on measurements of total blood flow. There was a great suspicion that there would be regional differences within the GI wall, say the mucosal circulation as opposed to the muscularis. And the reason for that deficit was that most of or all of the techniques that were then available were discontinuous. And to look at local control mechanisms, we needed something that had a much faster response time. We also needed something that was selective, that would selectively measure flow in either the mucosa or the muscularis. So we were very interested in figuring out whether or not the laser technique would in fact work in the GI tract. So our first efforts, or my first efforts, were in the stomach. Now, we needed both to be able to control total blood flow, which was going to be our initial test to compare laser Doppler measurements against measurements of total blood flow. So we needed to be able to control total blood flow, and we also needed access to both the serosal and mucosal surfaces. So we chose to use the chambered canine stomach preparation. And to do that, you cannulate the left gastroepiploic artery and vein that are perfusing this region of the gastric corpus, and then you excise this section of the tissue and clamp it between two plastic rings, like so. This would be the tissue here, the top ring and bottom ring. Clamp it together to prevent seepage of blood or loss of blood through the cut edges of the tissue. With this type of preparation, you can connect the arterial cannula to a pressurized reservoir, as we did, or to a flow pump, or in fact, actually, you could use some type of auto-perfusion setup. You can measure arterial pressure. You can also, with an electromagnetic flow probe, get a good indication of what total blood flow is to the preparation. Initially, we used a combination of micro-manipulators and clamps to hold the probes against the serosal and mucosal surfaces. Subsequently, we went ahead and modified our approach to use a record player tone arm to hold the mucosal probe, such that in cases of rather extreme gastric motility, that the probe would ride up and down against the mucosal surface rather than losing probe contact or getting motion artifacts. And I'll talk more about this later. This is a picture of the actual preparation itself. You can see here the tone arm I was speaking of. This here would be the laser Doppler fiber optic probe encased in a steel cylinder. And this is the surface of the gastric mucosa with its folded surface. Now, our first idea was to try gross manipulations of total blood flow. And we reasoned that it would be nice to both broaden the range of blood flow and also use something that might quiet down the tissue and minimize gastric motility. So we maximally dilated these tissues with isoproterenol. And the third advantage of isoproterenol vasodilation was that it would prevent any sort of redistribution of blood flow between the different layers, which might give us a nonlinearity in a comparison against total blood flow. In this case, you can see that we altered perfusion pressure. I'd like you to look primarily at the right half of this slide. We did step increases in perfusion pressure followed by an occlusion. You can see that this was followed by nice step changes in total blood flow, which was mirrored by the laser measurements from the mucosal surface and from the serosal surface. Plotted the data up against comparing the laser measurements against electromagnetic total flow. You can see that there was a good strong linear correlation from both surfaces, which was very pleasing to see. Did a number of them and found that the technique was reproducible. We could consistently get a good strong linear correlation between laser measurements, laser Doppler measurements, and total blood flow. Now, we were using prototype instruments at that time, and one fear that you have whenever you're working with a prototype is that perhaps nobody else in the world is going to be able to duplicate your results. And so we were pleased when we were able to obtain a TSI unit and additionally some of the other units available also. And we found similar results with the TSI unit. Again, step changes in perfusion pressure and total flow were mirrored very nicely by the laser measurements from the mucosal surface with a strong linear correlation between the two. Now this would, on the one hand, give you the idea that perhaps you could in fact come up with some type of a calibration constant in the stomach. Now there's two reasons why there's a problem with that. One is one that Bob already spoke of a little bit earlier, is that oftentimes there are differences in the slopes obtained in the same tissue in different locations, which may be due to some differences in the optical property of the tissue, perhaps a different number of capillaries under the probe. It's really unknown why it occurs, but it does occur with all too great a frequency. And so this difference in the slopes would make that a bit of a problem. The other idea is that you really wouldn't want to be able to, or we desperately did not want it to correlate all that well with total blood flow, because we were hoping that it was going to be a selective measurement of mucosal blood flow. And you recall that we had given isoproterenol just so that we could linearize and prevent any redistributions of blood flow. And in fact, what you see if you don't use isoproterenol in the stomach is that you do get a divergence away from linearity, and that in fact under normal circumstances, mucosal blood flow is maintained fairly well despite rather large changes in total blood flow. So you really couldn't work, we didn't want to be able to calibrate against total blood flow. But what about another more selective measurement? Hydrogen clearance, although discontinuous, is a very popular and established technique for measuring superficial blood flow in the GI tract. We did in fact find that there was a strong linear correlation between laser Doppler measurements and hydrogen clearance measurements in the stomach, which was also gratifying. However, I should point out that Ganna and his other Canadian colleagues compared laser measurements with hydrogen clearance and found the same problem with diverging slopes. So even here, it may not be possible to use hydrogen clearance as the gold standard to come up with a calibration constant. Now, to explore this idea of selectivity a little bit further, let me give you an idea of what we're up against. In the stomach, you have stomach or the intestine dealing with basically three different layers: an innermost mucosal layer, a submucosal layer, and a muscularis serosal layer. According to the theory, to Dr. Bonner's theory, the volume of this measurement is on the order of 1 cubic millimeter. Now, if we go back here, oops, that was supposed to be backwards.
Hold it down.
There we go. If we go backwards, if this total thickness of the wall is, say, 1 millimeter, then obviously you're going to get a measure of total blood flow, which is not what we wanted. We were using the dog's stomach, however, which is on the order of 3 to 5 millimeters. And so there was a good chance that we were, in fact, selectively measuring just mucosal blood flow or just muscularis blood flow. but there's no real a priori way to determine exactly what the volume of that measurement is. So we reasoned one real quick way to do it would be perhaps to interpose a thickness of tissue, unperfused, that we thought estimated the volume of measurement. So we scraped off a layer of mucosa from an adjacent section of stomach and placed it between the probe and the perfused mucosa. And you can see that when we interposed this layer of tissue, the flow signal dropped basically to 0, okay, which is pretty gratifying. And if we repeated a fairly consistent perturbation, like an arterial occlusion, and looked at the subsequent reactive hyperemic response, which is this overshooting blood flow following the release of the occlusion, normally that occurs in the mucosa as well. If we repeated that after interposing that layer of tissue, you can see that the signal was almost completely attenuated, suggesting that we're looking at the volume of the measurement in this tissue is approximately the thickness of the gastric mucosa. But I should also point out that the optical characteristics of unperfused tissue may be radically different from those of perfused tissue. Now, another line of reasoning that we used was, what if we could make the flow signals diverge from the opposite sides? Say we could increase mucosal blood flow and decrease muscularis blood flow, or at least hold it constant. If we couldn't see those flow changes from opposite sides, it would also suggest that we were not at least working with a transmural measurement. One thing we consistently did was we were always checking our zeros, and we noticed very soon that we always got this reactive hyperemic response in the mucosa, and we almost never got it in the muscularis. Now, that was true with our prototype instruments, and it also turned out to be true with all the commercial instruments that we used. In this case, we placed Paramed on the mucosa and the prototype on the muscularis, and then simply switched the probes. And you can see that the reactive hyperemic response only occurred in the mucosa, not in the muscularis, regardless of which instrument was used. This was consistent in a complete study comparing the TSI, the Paramed, and our prototype instruments. And invariably, we got a nice reactive hyperemic response in the mucosa, but not in the muscularis. Along those same lines was the idea that there are selective vasodilators, that you could preferentially dilate the mucosa as opposed to the muscularis. In the event of having a good vasodilation, such as with adenosine, we gave an infusion of adenosine, got a nice increase in total blood flow that was picked up by the mucosal probe. But what was seen from the serosal side in the muscularis was actually a decrease in blood flow, suggesting that you can't see that increase in blood flow through the thickness of the muscularis. Similar response with isoproterenol. Again, nice increase in blood flow in the mucosa, not registered from the muscularis. This was true in an overall study with all of the different instruments. Again, the increase in mucosal blood flow, no change or a slight decrease in muscularis. Now, Dr. Bonner alluded to the problem of motion artifacts, and it was something that we were acutely aware of that we were probably going to have a problem with. And you've probably noticed in all the tracings that we've got these big oscillations in blood flow. Now, we didn't know at the time whether or not those were really oscillations in blood flow. It could very well have been nothing more than motility, in which case we've got a really terrible situation as far as our signal-to-noise ratio is concerned. Extracting a flow signal from that would have been difficult. So, one way that we approached it was to, refine our preparation. I mentioned early on that we initially were using a micromanipulator to hold the probe rigidly against the mucosal surface. And you can see this is an early tracing from that type of setup. You can see that during our zeros, it was an incredibly noisy signal. Okay? When we went ahead and switched to that tone arm that I mentioned, the zeros became much more quiet. We were a lot more confident with our signal at that point. We refined the preparation, but we still had the flow oscillations. And we still didn't know, or the signal oscillations, that we didn't know if those were real or not. As a matter of fact, if we went ahead and looked at the oscillations in the mucosal and serosal signals with the laser technique, and we compared them with the spikes of electrical activity that we were able to record from the muscularis. Now, those spikes of electrical activity occur in sync with the active contractions of the muscles in the muscularis layer. It was rather disconcerting to find that the frequency of the electrical spikes was the same as the frequency of the flow oscillations, suggesting that perhaps it was nothing more than a motion artifact. And we had the idea of trying something a little bit different. We reasoned that if the oscillations were due simply to the movement of the tissue, what would happen if we removed the red blood cells and looked at the oscillations? If they still occurred, then in fact it would be a motion artifact. If they went away when we removed the red cells, then it would be good evidence that we were in fact looking at a flow oscillation. So what we did was we hooked up two arterial reservoirs, one of which was filled with whole blood, one of which was filled with an albumin solution. We had a three-way stopcock connecting the two to the arterial cannula so that we could switch back and forth between the two perfusates. And this is two different experiments, the top three tracings and the bottom three tracings. Total blood flow in the topmost, mucosal blood flow, and the electrical activity again. The oscillations are in fact in sync with the electrical activity in both sets of experiments. When we switched to the albumin solution from the blood solution, had a phenomenal increase in blood flow due to the rather instantaneous decrease in the viscosity of the perfusate, so that was not unexpected. But it was very gratifying to us to see that the laser signal went basically to zero in both cases, despite the persistence of the electrical activity. And then when we switched the stopcock back again, the oscillations in the Laser-Doppler signal came back and were again in sync with the electrical activity. Now, I don't know why vasomotion and gastric motility should be in sync, but I'm fairly confident that those oscillations that we see with the laser are not motion artifacts, but are in fact related to oscillations in blood flow. So to summarize, my experiences with the laser, I was very pleased with it. I was able to get a lot of good physiologic data, and I'm confident that it yields, at least in our preparation under the experimental conditions that we used it in, that it yields selective linear measurements of blood flow. The linearity, as I showed you, was when we compared it against measurements of total blood flow. At least when you've got a vasodilated preparation, it's highly linear. If you compare it against another selective technique, such as hydrogen clearance, it's also linear. In the intestine, it's also been compared against microsphere measurements and again found to be linear. The selectivity of the measurement, which is going to be highly dependent on the thickness of the tissue. I can't emphasize that enough. If you start using a smaller animal like a rat, you're likely to have a transmural measurement, not a selective measurement. But in our case, the reactive hyperemic responses, which were seen in the mucosa but not from the muscularis, the selective vasodilators with the increase in mucosal flow not seen from the serosal side, and our non-perfused tissue, all of these things combined suggest very strongly that it's a selective measurement in the canine stomach. And then lastly, the sensitivity or the temporal resolution of the technique allows you to examine very rapid phenomena such as the reactive hyperemic response, but it can also resolve such things as those signal oscillations, which would be nice to still know a little bit more about. Thank you very much.
In 1975, I heard Michael Stern give a presentation about Laser-Doppler Flowmetry at that time, and very much in its infancy. And when he said that he could reflect a laser beam off the surface of the skin and make a measurement of blood flow from that, skepticism is probably an understatement of the way I felt. Nevertheless, over the ensuing few years, instrumental developments such as Dr. Nilsson's in Sweden, and theoretical developments such as Dr. Bonner spoke about earlier this morning, made me review my sense of skepticism about the method and actually consider using it for some questions that we had in our lab. Now you have to bear in mind that there was some initial sense of skepticism on my part, and I felt that in order to use a new technique, there were certain questions that I had to answer for myself about it. One, a validation. What is it measuring? Specifically, is it giving a signal that accompanies changes in skin blood flow? Is it only skin? There are a lot of questions raised about depth. Both the previous speakers have spoken about that already. But it was important to us to assure ourselves that the signal that we received from the laser Doppler was specific to skin. We had to at least test that question. The last part of my talk this morning, I'm going to talk about some unique uses made available by this particular method, which we have used in our laboratory. Understand that these are just a couple of examples, and other laboratories have made good use of the laser in other ways, but using its unique properties. Our first approach was to ask the question, does it track skin blood flow? What we thought was to make use of some information that was available from plethysmography, a classical technique for limb blood flow in humans. The particular information that we wanted to make use of was the fact that during whole body heat stress, the increase in forearm blood flow is confined to the skin. So our approach then was to measure laser Doppler flow in volts. At the same time, measure forearm blood flow by plethysmography during a period of heat stress. The heat stress in this case is caused by water-perfused suits raising the skin temperature with the internal temperature then following thereafter. The response to that then is an increase in skin blood flow. Again, muscle blood flow does not rise with this kind of heat stress. We see an increase in total forearm blood flow and then a parallel increase in laser Doppler flow. Now, taking the data from these two measures and plotting them against each other, we get this kind of a correlation. Well, this was a delight to our eyes to see this kind of a relationship, a nice tight relationship, a high correlation coefficient between the laser Doppler method and the total forearm blood flow. So this observation we felt was really quite promising for further uses of the laser Doppler method for measuring skin blood flow. And so we did it a number of times. The individual data points are not shown just for clarity, but this represents 5 separate studies, 2 of them from the same person, again measuring total forearm blood flow, skin plus muscle, but during a heat stress protocol where only skin is increasing versus the laser Doppler. Now, there's sort of good news and bad news in this. The good news is that these are the correlation coefficients, very high correlation coefficient in each case. A linear relationship between the laser Doppler output and the plethysmographic output. The bad news, of course, as you can see, and has been alluded to already this morning, is that there is no singular relationship. Instead, each study tended to define a different relationship between these 2 measures. Now, it's our own feeling, and I think Dr. Bonner already indicated this to be his feeling as well, is that the heterogeneity of the tissue, in this case the skin, gives rise to different relationships at a particular small spot as measured by the laser Doppler when you compare it to a more global measure of blood flow, such as with the plethysmograph. So we felt that we had a method that could linearly follow blood flow to skin, although we were careful always to present data in terms of a normalized output rather than basing something on absolute values, because again, there was no way to know how representative one site was for blood flow on an absolute level, although all sites followed the same geometry. They followed the same pattern of blood flow as did the plethysmograph. So the next question we wanted to address was the issue of depth. Now, Dr. Bonner's already indicated that number one, this is a probabilistic estimate of depth. Number two, that is his feeling that the depth of measurement would be 1 to 1.5 millimeters at maximum. But there are also data in the literature that indicate a much greater measurement depth by the laser Doppler method. And we felt it incumbent on ourselves to find whether this measurement was unique to skin or whether it included in the signal something from the underlying skeletal muscle. We used a couple of approaches for that. These data are from Jean-Louis Salmet and the study that he did in our laboratory, in which he measured total forearm blood flow, again by plethysmography, and then laser Doppler flow from the dorsal and ventral surfaces of the same forearm. Now, during this period, 3 minutes, was a period of mild hand exercise, which involves, of course, the forearm muscles. The rationale being that by that exercise, we should raise muscle blood flow, but we shouldn't be changing skin blood flow to any great extent. Probably not at all, as a matter of fact. And then to follow the post-exercise hyperemia in the forearm, again, the forearm blood flow measures total forearm blood flow, hence both skin and muscle. And we see here a large increase in total forearm blood flow. This would be an increase in muscle blood flow following the exercise. And then to see what happened with the laser Doppler signal. During the exercise, we see a large increase in the signal. That's not blood flow, that's noise. This underscores the problem of motion artifact. These are overlying the active arm, and so it precludes the use of the laser Doppler for making measurements of blood flow to skin over active muscle. However, when the exercise stopped, you can see that quite abruptly the signal returns to the level that we had before the exercise began. Hence, this large hyperemia that's coming down over a couple of minutes is not seen in the laser Doppler signal. This is certainly strong evidence favoring a superficial measurement by the laser Doppler, at least one that does not include skeletal muscle. Another attempt to test that notion is shown here, in which rather than an active hyperemia, we looked at a reactive hyperemia. We had generated data, Dr. Taylor in my laboratory had generated data showing that a local temperature, locally warming the skin to 42 degrees, caused a maximum blood flow. That is, smooth muscle activity was totally removed in that. That's a study that was done with plethysmography. We thought to take advantage of that by examining the laser Doppler responses to occlusion, to the reactive hyperemia following occlusion, at a time when there was no smooth muscle activity. The rationale being that if there was no smooth muscle activity, then the skin wouldn't show a reactive hyperemia. The muscle still would be doing that. Let me go through this. Here we occluded the arm, the whole arm, for 10 minutes. This is during normothermia. The skin is not being warmed. On release of the occlusion, we get a large reactive hyperemia, although not a maximal level of blood flow, which then comes back towards control. At this point, then, we locally warmed the tissue, the skin, to 42 degrees. At this point, skin can relax no further. Smooth muscle tone has been removed. We repeat the occlusion, driving blood flow down to 0, and now when we release the occlusion, the blood flow is restored, but back to the level that it had before the occlusion. At the same time, however, while this blood flow is returning to control, muscle blood flow, I'm not showing you those data, but muscle blood flow is showing its typical reactive hyperemia. The muscle blood flow is increasing, in this case, increasing to well over 80 milliliters per 100 grams per minute. Nevertheless, that large increase in muscle blood flow was not something that we could detect from the skin surface, and this certainly removed our reservations about whether the depth of measurement of, by this device included anything other than skin. So this is then the depth issue. The other issues, well, the other thing I wanted to just mention were some of the unique properties, or some of the uses that we made of the, have made in our laboratory of the unique features of the laser Doppler. It's continuous, specific to skin, high frequency response, and it can be applied to any area of skin. These data are data gathered by Dr. Fred Taylor in my laboratory. And this is, without going greatly into the physiology, this is just to show that we could make measurements of skin blood flow responses, either laser Doppler flow or flow divided by pressure, that is a conductance, this is cutaneous vascular conductance, during isometric exercise and during dynamic exercise. And this is a finding of his that while there is a pronounced vasoconstriction of the skin in response to the initiation of dynamic exercise, there's very little change in response to isometric exercise, and if the skin is locally warm, there may actually be a vasodilation. Again, this is a kind of data that would be very difficult to gather by a more conventional plethysmographic methods. Now, another use of the laser Doppler method that we've made in our lab recently is a series of studies that Dr. Dean Kellogg did there. Now, this is a schematic of a simplified schematic of how the skin blood flow is controlled by the nervous system. Specifically, there is not only the traditional adrenergic vasoconstrictor system, but there is also an active vasodilator system. A system of autonomic, of sympathetic nerves, which when activated will cause blood flow in the skin to rise. Now, one of the difficulties in studying control of skin blood flow by these systems is that if you ask questions about one, the other is always there, and so you can't necessarily derive conclusions about one of these arms of the sympathetic nervous system without knowing something about the other. What Dr. Kellogg did was come up with a method to block the vasoconstrictor system. Specifically, he ionophoresed beryllium, which blocks norepinephrine release, into an area of skin, into a whole area of skin, which would include both kinds of nerves. Beryllium is taken up specifically by vasoconstrictor nerves. Norepinephrine release is blocked. And then from that area of skin, we can make a measurement of blood flow with the laser Doppler instrument. We can also make a measurement of blood flow from a nearby area that hasn't been treated with the beryllium. So we have then one area that has only vasodilator control intact, and another area at the same time we can make a measurement of another area that has both systems intact. And this is just an example of testing that method. Conductance here is cutaneous vascular conductance. Again, it's laser Doppler flow divided by blood pressure during a period of whole body cold stress. The normal skin shows a nice vasoconstrictor response to that. Skin pretreated with beryllium doesn't, meaning we have blocked out the constrictor system. Nevertheless, the responses, the vasodilator responses to heat stress are maintained in both areas of measurement. That is, an area which has been treated with beryllium and therefore has no constrictor tone or no intact constrictor system, and another area that's got both the dilator and the constrictor system are both intact. Now, yesterday at the poster sessions, Dr. Kellogg presented these data, but this is just to wrap it up basically, and this is looking at responses to lower body negative pressure with a beryllium treated site and a beryllium untreated site. And you can see with lower body negative pressure, which is an orthostatic stimulus, You get a nice vasoconstriction in the areas that have an intact vasomotor system, no change in a system without a vasoconstrictor, without the vasoconstrictor system, i.e. that has been treated with the rutillium. Unless you do that during heat stress, in which both sites are seen to cause a vasoconstriction or to respond to the lower body negative pressure with a vasoconstriction. These are taken as data indicating that the vasodilator system is in fact withdrawn during lower body negative pressure in the presence of heat stress. Well, that's simply an example of one of the uses of the laser Doppler, but it is really taking advantage of its unique properties that we were able to carry out those studies. And this is just a summary of my experience with the laser Doppler instrument. Its continuous nature, it's linear, that we found in our relationships with plethysmography. It's selective to skin. The active and reactive hyperemia of muscle failed to show any signal change at the surface of the skin. The high spatial resolution, this was a particular advantage in the last series of studies I talked about, because we could treat very small areas of skin with the rutillium and yet monitor blood flow there. It is applicable to any area of skin. I failed to point it out, but on the slide from Dr. Taylor's work involving isometric exercise, that was blood flow to skin over the sternum. But it is our practice to normalize relative to something. Now, we often do it relative to resting values. Sometimes we do it relative to maximal values, but in either case, some kind of a normalization procedure, I think, is necessary. Going back to the high spatial resolution, the multiple slopes that I showed you in terms of the relationship with plethysmography mean that no site is particularly reflective of the absolute level of blood flow on a global basis. So hence, we at this point at least, are stuck with percentage changes. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is my first time in Washington, and I hope to come back again soon. If we can just switch over to the next cassette, there we'll look at the first slide. Thank you. And if we can dim the light a little bit. I'm going to talk about recent and future development in laser-Doppler flowmetry, and most of the things I'm going to talk about has been done at the Department of Biomedical Engineering, Linköping University in Sweden. And the things I'm going to touch on here are essentially three different topics. First of all, I would like to address an old problem in a young discipline, namely that of assessment of the measuring volume, as we have heard about here today. We have recently done some studies based on Monte Carlo simulation that may give us some help in this area. Then I will go on and talk about integrating probe, because some of the problems with laser-Doppler flowmetry is that the probes may be just too good. They may have a too good spatial resolution, and therefore we developed an integrating probe some years ago. And from there I will finally go on to talk about how this one-point method of laser-Doppler flowmetry may be converted into some kind of imaging system that will allow us to map the flow in a specific tissue area. So Monte Carlo simulation can be used to model the diffusion of photons down into tissue, and this is just a schematic diagram of how it may work. In the Monte Carlo simulation, we are taking the photons one by one, and we look at how they are migrating down into tissue. And then we need to know something about the optical properties, and the things we need to know something about is first of all, the path length between different scattering points, and we need to know something about, once the scattering occurs, the scattering angle. So these are optical parameters that are specific to different kinds of tissue. And we feed this into some kind of probabilistic model, and out of this probability distributions we can extract values that will tell us how long the pathway L at L1, for instance, is here, and then something about the scattering angle. So if we continue up here to inject, start up here to inject one photon into tissue, we calculate L1, and then we calculate the scattering angle, and then this goes on and so forth all the way. And finally, these photons may be absorbed, or some of them will come back to the tissue surface. Now this is done over and over again, and in reality we are using something like 20,000 different photons to simulate the scattering process in this area. Now this is a very simple simulation. We are using here, in this case, 50 different photons, and this is two-dimensional scattering. In reality, we are of course making three-dimensional scattering, but this is just to show you how it may look like on a computer screen. And we can see up here we are using an absorption coefficient of about 0.2 scatterings per millimeter, and a scattering coefficient of about 30 per millimeter. That is to say that scattering is a much more likely event than absorption in most tissues. We have also a mean cosine of the scattering angle here, which we have set to 0.8 in this case. So you can also see by feeding the light down to a transmitting fiber, we can see that the scattering volume is within about a couple of 100 microns, right in the vicinity of the transmitting fiber. Now, we made some three-dimensional simulations in order to try to estimate the average measuring depth in skin tissue by using two different kinds of probes, as you can see in this slide. And we use data from the literature on the absorption coefficient, which is 2 per centimeter, scattering coefficient 188 per centimeter, and an average cosine of about 0.8. And in this case, we are using fiber diameters of 120 microns for both these kind of probes. But however, in the probe to the left, we have a fiber center spacing of about 250 microns, and in this case, we are keeping the fibers very close together, giving us a fiber center spacing of 126. And from this, we used, as I said, about 20,000 different photons to simulate the scattering of light in tissue. And so we could calculate the average measuring depth to, in this case, about 450 microns in skin tissue, and in this case, about 200 microns in skin tissue. Of course, if we have other parameters up here, as we may have if we have other kinds of tissue, then the values down here will also be different. But this is the sort of the range that we may expect when we are working on skin tissue. And we can also see that by changing the configuration of the probe, we may, to some extent at least, change the measuring depth of the probes themselves. Now, another question that one may ask when using laser-Doppler flowmetry is how many capillaries are there really just under the probe? And if we assume that we have about 50 capillaries per square millimeter, which is a reasonable value for at least forearm human skin, and we're using one transmitting fiber and two receiving fibers, then we can calculate the total surface area of the fibers. If we are using, for instance, 700 micron fibers, and we're using 120 diameter micron fibers, and then all the way down to 50 microns. We calculate the total surface area right here, and then we multiply this simply by the capillary density, and we can see that the number of capillaries that we have right under the probe in the most sensitive area of the scattering volume is about 60 for the probe based on 700 micron diameter fibers. However, if we reduce this to 120 microns, then we will see that we will only integrate over something like 1.7 on the average capillaries. And if we go all the way down to 50 microns, then we have a situation where there may be or may not be a capillary right in the most sensitive portion of the scattering volume. So this may explain some of the difficulties we heard from the previous speakers. Now, this again shows the problem in another way. If we have a probe that we place on the tip of a finger, for instance, we can measure blood flow corresponding to A. And then we move the probe just a little bit, 1 millimeter or something. We will get another value, B. We move it another millimeter, we get C. And then we maybe have another value again, D. And the question that one may ask then is, of course, which is the correct value of all these? And the answer, again, is, of course, that we have a spatial variation in skin blood flow. And the problem is that the spatial resolution of the probes may be just too good. Now, in order to some extent overcome this problem, we developed an averaging probe some years ago where we used not only one transmitting fiber, but altogether 7 transmitting fibers, as you can see here. The laser light is coupled down into 7 different fibers. And next to each of these transmitting fibers, we have 2 receiving fibers that picks up the light. So altogether we have 7 scattering volumes here. And this allowed us to average the data. And indeed, we found that the coefficient of variation was reduced by a factor of square root of 7, which was in good accordance with the theory. So such a probe may be helpful if we want to make measurements of average blood flow in skin. Now, the problem in clinical situation is often, as we can see in this slide, which on the upper part here is the foot of a diabetic patient. And we can see the toes have all gone into necrosis here. It may be more useful in this situation to get an image or be able to map the flow in the whole foot instead of taking a single value, because it all depends on where we place the probe, what kind of value that we will get. And we have a similar situation down here where we have a pressure ulcer in an elderly patient. So the question is, would it be possible to convert this single point measurement of Laser-Doppler Flowmetry into some kind of imaging system? And we have been working on this project for about 1 year now, and we have some preliminary results. Now, this is a schematic diagram of the perfusion imager, as we call it, works. We have a helium neon laser operating at 2 milliwatts, and the laser beam goes into the scanner, and the scanner is composed of stepping motors that are controlling the position of these 2 mirrors. And this will allow us to move the laser beam back and forth over the object, which in this case is a hand. So in fact, what we do, we direct the laser beam at one point, we collect the data, and then we move it on to the next point, collect data again, and so on. And the backscattered light is picked up by either 2, as in this case, or it could also be 1 photodetectors that are positioned about 20 centimeters above the object. And all the signals, the intensity and the Doppler signals are fed into a processor and collected in the computer. And when we have captured all the data, we can build up an image of this object. And in this image, we can color code the flow in such a way that, for instance, black color means no or a low blood flow, and red color may mean a very high blood flow. This is an early prototype again of the instrument. You can't see much in this, but inside here we have the laser, and in the front we have the optical scanner. And down here you can see the laser beam now pointing on the skin. And up here we have the photodetectors. Here are some data of the system. Today we can scan an area up to something like 12 times 12 centimeters, but this is by no means a theoretical limit. That is what you can use if you want to look at the blood flow in a hand, for instance. We are using 64 times 64 pixels. That gives us altogether 4,096 different laser Doppler probes, if you so like. This will also give us a resolution of something like 4 square millimeters. And we have chosen to use 6 different colors to code the signal. So we're not really looking at blood flow values, but rather blood flow intervals here. And we think that if we use 6 colors, we get a reasonable good resolution. And the scanning time to capture all the data today is 4 minutes altogether. Now I will show you some slides on different objects that we have put into the imager and their corresponding images. Now this is a phantom that we used, or what we call it sometimes an artificial finger. This is nothing but a test tube which is transparent, and inside a test tube we have a solution of microspheres that are moving freely, and these are the equivalent of the red blood cells. And maybe some of you on the first row at least can see that up here we have a non-transparent cover. And if the laser beam hits this area here, there will be no Doppler shift, and this should then show up as a black area on the corresponding image. So we put this one into the imager, and this is what we got on the computer screen. Now, first of all, this is 64 times 64 pixels. And all the data is first captured, and we take the highest blood flow value and set this to 100%. And then we scale everything downwards from linearly, downwards from 100% to 0. So a value from 0 to 10% of maximal value is coded in black color. And this is corresponding to no blood flow, or at least very low blood flow values. Then we can see here that the non-transparent covers are now color-coded in black. And when the laser beam hits the microspheres, there will be a Doppler shift, of course, and this area here and up here is color-coded in yellow and red in this case. So this was very encouraging, and we went on and put some real objects into the scanner. Now, this is a perfectly normal hand. We have a little small ring up here, which we expected to show up in black color in the image. Now, if you put this one into the imager, you can find something like this on the computer screen. Now, first of all, this hand was warm and dilated, and therefore we can find the highest blood flow values at the fingertips, now color-coded in yellow and red. And here is the ring, which appears in black color. And here is another interesting area down here, because here seems to be some kind of hyperemia. And indeed, when we looked at the finger afterwards, we found that there was a small scar in this area here, which we couldn't detect before. So it's quite sensitive. Now, this again is the same hand. The difference now is that we have at the top of the long finger now appears all in black, telling us that there is no blood flow in the most distal part of this finger. And the explanation for that you can see in the next slide. There is a little rubber band here to clue the blood flow to the fingertip. The interesting thing is, if you just look at this photograph here, you cannot really tell just by looking at the color. Maybe this looks somewhat more dark, but just by looking at the color, it's hard to say which one is occluded and which one is not. However, this is quite easily picked up by the imager. Now, this is another situation. Again, a normal hand, but now with a small experimental burn that we made right here. And as you may have heard yesterday, we also have problems in Sweden doing animal experiments, so this is one way to solve it. Now, anyway, we thought that maybe we should find some kind of hyperemia right around this burn. So we put this one into the imager, and this is what came up on the screen. Now, you can see here that right in the center of the burn, which is about 2 × 2 millimeter, there is lower blood flow than just next to the burn. And the reason for this is that there was already a scar formation here, so the blood flow is somewhat lower right in the center. But here we have an area with hyperemia, and in total we can see the distance across between the dark blue and the light blue here is about 2 centimeters. And of course, we can also make a close-up of this if we like, just by changing the step length of the scanner or by reducing the distance between the object and the detector. And the resolution here is something like a half to 1 millimeter. And you can study this in more detail. And then, of course, you can follow this over several days, which we have done. And you can also make histograms and make a cut across if you like. This is something that we've done only the other week before I left. And what we did here, these are 2 fingers. And before we put these fingers into the scanner, we made an electrical stimulation of the nerve in this area down here. And it's known that if we stimulate the nerve, it may produce a vasodilatation. So we put this into the scanner, and here you can see the area that indeed was dilated very much in the center, and then we have the yellow area, which is also dilated, but not as much as in the center. So maybe this may be a way of investigating the innervation zones of different nerves. Now, we have also done some very preliminary clinical studies. One thing that you might think about is to look at the blood flow in leg ulcers, for instance, which frequently occur in elderly patients, and they seldom heal spontaneously. This is a typical leg ulcer. And down here we put a marker just to recognize the position of this ulcer when it shows up on the image. And the image you will see in the next slide is about this size. And this is what we found, the marker, difficult to see, but it's down here. This is the black thing you see down here. And the borderline of the ulcer is something here between the dark blue and the light blue. And you can also see in this slide that the more distal part of this ulcer seems to be better perfused than the more proximal part down here. And the reason for this we really don't know yet. Now, I would like to sum up here with also making a summary, but a little bit different from that we heard of the previous speakers. I would like to compare Laser-Doppler flowmetry with ultrasonic flow meters, because both of them are measuring blood flow. Ultrasonics, however, measuring the blood flow in the major vessels and in the heart, while we on this side are looking at the microcirculation. But if we first of all look at the basic setup of the two methods, we have, of course, the continuous Doppler, and this was developed in the middle of the 50s for the ultrasonic Dopplers. And on this side, we have the continuous Doppler developed in the middle of the 70s. If we go to the more advanced Doppler system, on this side we have range-gated systems that allow you to look at vessels positioned at different depths into tissue. In this side we have nothing similar yet, and the reason for that, of course, is that the speed of light is so much higher than that of sound, so it's difficult to make range gating. However, recently people have started to look at the propagation of light pulses into tissue, so that maybe will come in the future. If we go to the invasive applications, we see on this side that we have seen quite recently coronary imaging from the inside of the vessels. But on this side, we can, of course, introduce an optical fiber into the vessel and measure blood flow inside the vessel. Or we can use a needle probe that will allow us to measure blood flow deep into the muscle. If we come to the flow units, there is also a difference between the two methods, because ultrasonic Dopplers are measuring essentially velocity or velocity distribution. On this side, we are more measuring a combination of velocity and concentration, which is more towards a kind of volume blood flow. And there is a discussion going on whether we should use absolute flow units, which may give us some problem if we move from one tissue to another, because this amplification factor could be quite different. If we are more conservative, we may stick to the arbitrary flux or flow units. And finally, if we come to the imaging, we have, of course, the very important duplex scanning system, and maybe also now on the Laser-Doppler side, what I call the flying spot or the flow mapping system that I've just shown you here. Thank you very much.
Who had the question back there? George Williams?
How long did a scan take?
The question was, how long does a scan take? It takes about 4 minutes as we run it today to capture all the data. But I think we can come down to something like maybe 2 or 1 minutes in the future, getting better scanner. But I think it will be very difficult to go down to real time, because this will have then we have to use parallel processing, which is quite different.
Can I ask a question about your system? How do you scan the detector, or are you just integrating all the light that's reflected from the tissue from your laser scan?
Yeah, we pick up, the detector is stable, and we are just picking up all the light, and most of the light is coming, the beam width is about 800 microns. So this is the kind of area that we are picking up the light from.
You know, that's very similar to the initial design that Mike Stern did back in the early 70s. And the problem with that kind of geometry is that first you get a surface reflection, which may, a direct specular reflection, which may lead to a totally unnormalizable signal. And you also have a problem of when you integrate all the light that's reflected, you get the very short paths enhanced, so that you're looking at even more superficial flow than the conventional devices. In your talk, you also mentioned that the fiber separation modeling at 100 or 250 micron separation. Most of the spectrometers or devices people are using are 500 micron separations. So that allows you to go deeper, and that also means that your measurement volume is larger. You're not looking at just one capillary, but all the capillaries along those paths.
Yeah. Let me make a comment on the last thing here. I think that's true, the measuring volume is larger, but I think the most sensitive portion of the measuring volume is right under the fiber tip, because all the light has to pass through the transmitting fiber, and all the light that eventually ends up at the receiving fiber also has to pass through that area. So there is a weighing factor, so to say, in this.
This raises another point, which I think is real important, and that is the artifacts that we measured, the one we didn't measure was if you have a large superficial vessel that's right underneath the optical fibers, then you've got a very high flow signal. I'm not talking about Dr. Nielsen's scanner, but for all the commercial devices that people are using. That's perhaps particularly a problem when you're looking at the muscularis flow of the intestine, where if you're looking at the serosal surface, there are large superficial vessels. If you hit one of those, we saw that when we were doing muscle biopsy studies, where the exposed surface of the muscle, you get anomalously high readings at discrete points that had to do with large surface vessels. So you really, and those flows aren't representative of microvascular flow, and they may scale with large vessel flow, but they're not calibratable because they're dependent on the diameter of the vessel. So you really have to avoid a large superficial vessel being directly underneath your fiber optics.
Do we have another question all the way back?
I just
What you just talked about, we found it in the skin, and looking at the subepidermal plexus by video microscopy, that capillary recruitment or vessel recruitment plays a role in the response of that tissue to heat stress. That being the case, if we have, say, a significant increase in the actual number of perfused vessels, to what extent then is that going to modify the ability to detect flow in deeper layers by the laser Doppler system? Will that then serve as kind of a mask of the signal? You know what I mean?
Right. In general, with these small fiber separations, like half a millimeter, the optical path lengths are relatively small. They're on the order of a millimeter or so. The absorption of blood is usually not very significant. Even a big change in vascular volume doesn't change the reflected signal very much. So in general, it's not a problem. There certainly are some tissues, like the liver, where the absorption that's one of the most absorptive tissues, where that affects the measurement volume, and if there's some changes in those in the principal absorbers or pigments within, such as blood, within the liver, you may get a change in the reflected signal, and that may change your measurement volume. That's certainly one reason why people are using these devices at wavelengths that aren't strongly absorbed by blood. If you used a blue argon laser or something, you could make measurements, but be very sensitive.
We're using the infrared. As
the infrared has at 785, it doesn't have an oxygenation effect, such as you have at 633, because basically the oxy and deoxyhemoglobin absorbs the same. But the absorption coefficient for oxyhemoglobin is pretty comparable. So changes in blood volume have a very minor role to play in terms of penetration depth with small fiber separations. If you tried to scan over a larger volume, then it would have a bigger effect.
This is with the 1 millimeter probe, standard probe.
The standard probe geometry is half millimeter separation. In fact, we saw these effects. The first device that we made in the mid-70s with fiber optics had a millimeter separation. And we saw, comparing that to half millimeter separation, that there were blood volume effects. That as you change the volume, the two devices didn't track. And I think some of that was attenuating the volume that was being measured.
Go ahead and ask your question.
How does the Laser-Doppler flow measurements correlate under extreme hematocrit alterations?
Anybody want to take that one on?
Pete, do you want to do the experiment?
They want me to answer that question. That's because they don't want to answer the question. And unfortunately, when we made hematocrit changes in the perfusate of an isolated rat liver preparation, we got data we couldn't analyze. We had all kinds of changes. And I don't know what to blame that on, really. If the experiments were designed to do the kind of thing you'd like to know, to determine whether changes in the density or concentration of red cells in the tissue were really reflected in the output of these instruments, but the data we had simply were not interpreted.
And you would expect that if the microvascular hematocrit goes up, that there ought to be a change because relative to volumetric flow, right? Because you're measuring red cells scattering and not scattering in the plasma. So you are really measuring red cell flux. Functionally, we looked at sickle cell patients and compared them to normals, and we got the same average flow values in the basal state just because the flow was being regulated probably to deliver, for red cell delivery or oxygen delivery. So, sometimes...
The only other thing relative to that, though, is to remind you of what Jeff Keel was saying, and that was when we took all the red cells out of the perfusate, the laser Doppler signal did indeed fall essentially to zero. So that was gratifying, but trying to quantitate the effects was frustrating.
How do you handle the problem of skin areas where you have shunt flow and nutrient flow both? And how do you know what you're measuring if you have?
Well, didn't use it, but
We need a micro.
a big clue is looking at the velocity component. If you have shunt flow, they're very high velocities relative to what you would normally see, even in a.
Well,
in
but if you're picking up
dilated
just a
nutrient.
portion of that shunt flow,
I'm sorry?
if you're just picking up a certain portion of that, a very small portion of that very high flow, that's going to be in your system.
Right, it's a lump parameter, the way these systems aren't very good at differentiating different segments of the spectra. I think we all tried at various times to look at different bandwidths. We might be able to look at higher frequency shunt vessels more than the nutritive flow, but it doesn't work very well because of the optics, and you're averaging all angles in all possible directions relative to the velocity relative to the scattering vector.
Well, then let me ask, is to follow that up, what percentage of the flow in a human skin, let's say in the hand, would you say is due to AV anastomosis?
We're going to let a physicist answer that question.
In the hand, it would be, it depends to some extent on the thermal setting. It can be as high as 70, 80%.
No, I'm saying how much is measured by the laser Doppler?
Oh, who knows? He can't tell you.
Very high.
And I won't try. But on the other hand, if you look at some tissue like the forearm, then it's negligible. The anastomotic flow there in that skin is very small. So that's where we go, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Bonner. When you showed one of your slides, you were correlating the Laser-Doppler index to volumetric flow of the liver in terms of mils per gram tissue per minute. Now, in the case of the Laser-Doppler, you're measuring the superficial flow in the superficial vessels. In the case of the other unit, grams per, mils per gram per minute, you're measuring the whole organ. How do you relate the two? I mean,
I think that's a real
I find some
problem that the
inconsistency there.
physiologists. I've always preached that this is a physical measurement. It's measuring an absolute physical parameter.
Yes, I agree.
And the question is, how do we relate that to the measurements of blood flow that other physiologists have been making for years?
With great difficulty. That's the answer.
And it's clear that on one hand we're looking at a small volume.
right.
And if you look at various sites, you'll see variation of surface flow. And that typically in the beds I've looked at it is on the order of 15 to 30% coefficient of variation. If you now look at the fact that you're looking only at very superficial flow, the whole organ flow may be very non-homogeneous.
Yes, I agree. My concern is that when you have the whole organ flow and you are relating it to superficial vessels, there's inconsistency. It becomes very troublesome. And I say this because I've used all three machines, TSI, Metacific, and Pyramid. And unfortunately, one of the, I think, Metacific or TSI's salesmen tried to convince customers that Bonner says you can multiply by 6 or some number and get a certain volumetric flow, which is really nonsense.
I feel compelled to respond to that a little bit. I think there's several questions involved in what you're asking. I agree exactly with what you're saying. One is, can it be calibrated?
Right.
Okay, and I agree with Bob in the sense that it's a physical measurement, and given the right equations, there should be some way to calibrate it. The second question, though, is, has it been calibrated? And I think the multiplication by 6 is a fantasy. I know where some of that comes from, and it's off by at least a factor of 10 in my view. So, it depends on your tolerance a little bit of error, but the factor of 6 is, like I say, a fantasy. I don't agree with that.
Okay.
If I just say in response to that you also have to factor in when Dr. Johnson says that flow is a certain value in the skin, he's talking about integrated flow to the whole skin. This is only a very superficial measurement, and certainly whatever fraction of the volume is occupied by the epidermis without flow is essentially even leading to even lower values. So it's not sampling the dermis uniformly at all. It's a very superficial measurement, and that's non-uniform.
One question for Dr. Nielsen. That study you did in which you bent the skin of an individual and then did the scanning, how soon did you do the scanning?
Well, this wasn't quite after it. I think it was half a day or something after. And you can do it. We also did it on day number 2, 3, 4, and we saw how this area was sort of getting smaller and smaller.
I had a question over there.
Yes, I have a question relating to how you handle the data in terms of the normalization. I guess Dr. Johnson alluded to that. That slide that shows varying slopes and intercepts, which implies that the signal you get at zero flow is quite variable as well. Is it fair then to normalize your data simply by expressing as a percentage of the control flow? Shouldn't you take that zero intercept into consideration?
The intercept is a troubling feature that hasn't really been addressed much here. I can say that the intercept where it was, we got with the earlier pyramid instruments. I've not used the current ones, so don't take that as a comment about the pyramid instrument. On the other hand, with TSI, and I'm not really advertising TSI, but that's what we're using now, when you do those kind of correlations, you still get the mix of slopes that you saw. But the intercept is now moved from the Laser-Doppler axis over to the forearm blood flow axis. And that's, in fact, where it ought to be. So in practice, then, the normalization turns out to be okay. The zero flow occurs about where you would predict that it should, on the basis of the forearm blood flow having a muscle component to it. So I'm comfortable with that. I'm a little uncomfortable, however, with using a control or rest as the normalization factor, because I think that's more variable than something like a maximal blood flow. So it's become our habit more recently to after the study to go ahead and dilate the skin to a maximal value and use 100% there rather than the resting value.
And how about on the other end of the scale? Do you do anything to constrict maximally to get a zero?
Well, I think the lowest you can drive blood flow is zero. Right. So we'll use that as zero.
Well, but do you get a signal at zero flow? That's the point.
Well, not with the TSI instruments, and that's really the only instrument I can comment on that.
Yes.
My question is, does the angle of the flow affect your measurement? Because you put the flow on the skin of the tissue, you have sometimes different angle. Does that affect your measurement?
Well, I'll tell you theoretically. We've done a few measurements like this, but not very controlled measurements. But theoretically, what happens is the light is, for the whole theory to work at all, you have to assume that the light is being randomized by the static elements. That means that even if there are orientational structures like the capillary loops in the surface of the skin that are moving towards the surface and away principally, even if there are those kind of structures, the light itself is randomized, so it impinges on those red cells from all directions and gets scattered through all directions. And that in itself randomizes the effect that you get with Doppler ultrasound, where the orientation of the vessel plays a role. In the case of light scattering, with this diffusive light scattering, it doesn't appear to play a role.
Yes.
I guess maybe we'd like to have one of you comment, or all of you comment, on the prospect of using this technique as a parameter for measuring skin irritancy. I mean, you mentioned different heterogeneity of the skin and slight movement of the probe would make a big difference with the temperature or the animal movement. I guess I'm interested in finding ways of evaluating skin irritancy on test animals and over a number of spots on the animal over maybe a long period of time.
Thank you for asking that question. There's a chapter in my book on the subject. So I have another question. In the back.
Could you comment
We want to hear.
Could you comment on the use of a single fiber, where you are most using a transmitter and a receiver? And as well, could you comment on the effect of lensing, since you can change the field of light very nicely with lenses.
I guess this is not this question. People have done laser Doppler velocimetry with single fiber. You can certainly do that. In fact, when I started working with the fiber optic design, I talked to a guy that went to undergraduate school with me who was doing a laser Doppler velocimeter with a single fiber, and he's the one that suggested graded index fibers. You certainly can do it. The problem with doing it in this situation, and I think it's the same problem that I questioned Dr. Nielsen about his scanner, is that if you put light in at a point and collect it from the same point, you can get a specular reflection, and you can also you wait very short paths of light that happens to be momentarily backscattered, rather rare event, back into the volume. You get a very large heterogeneity in path lengths and sample volumes. So it's because of much more imprecise measurement than using two small fibers separated by a fixed distance. It really has to do with the sampling.
Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, one estimate the resistance or the conductance of the vasculature using the flow data. Is it correct to use the aorta pressure as perfusion pressure?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. Yes, I think so. You're not asking about the diameter of the particular vessels under the probe. You're asking about the rate of blood flow, and there the resistance is defined as the pressure difference divided by the flow. The pressure difference beginning with the distributing arteries. There's really no reason to try to divide the blood flow by a microvascular pressure at that point. You're asking about the total resistance across the tissue, and you're getting the total flow through it. It happens to go through the microvasculature. It also goes to the resistance vessels and the conducting vessels as well.
Go ahead with your question.
Could anyone please tell me what is the actual time needed to detect a real change in blood flow of any sort? The minimum amount of blood flow. What is the least amount of time to detect that?
It's a continuous measurement, practically instantaneously. As soon as it's changed,
There are time constants in the devices, and principally the integrating time constant, I think, in all the devices is about 100 milliseconds.
Okay, 100 milliseconds is fine.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, would you, any of you comment about the effect of light, ambient light on the LDF signal?
On what?
On the signal.
Ambient light, with the normalization factor to the reflected light, if you have an ambient light source that's very intense, then it may contribute to that local reflectance. And if it does, then it tends to decrease the flow readings because you're normalizing to some extraneous incoherent source that doesn't show the Doppler effect. In practice, that's not much of a problem. People put filters that are relatively selective for the laser source. In the detector, some of the commercial devices have that, some don't. That tends to minimize it. If you have a very bright source, a surgical light or something like that illuminating the field that you're working with, you certainly can get that kind of artifact, or it changes the calibration factor, it reduces your flow signals.
Yes, to the back.
I might just comment on the baseline dropping or not dropping all the way down. We just found putting an anti-vibration cable into the unit causes significant dropping of our baselines. I don't know how people's buildings vibrate, but ours did.
I'm glad you said that. Dr. Bonner thought we were the only lab in the world that suffered motion artifacts. But I'd like to thank you all very much for attending. Greatly appreciate you